Hello and welcome to Rundown, a podcast from PolitcsHome. I'm your host, Alan Tolhurst, and with me to discuss the future of the Conservative Party as it looks to finally, possibly move on from Boris Johnson is Siobhan Bailey, the Tory MP for Stroud, alongside Ryan Shorthouse, founder of the Liberal Conservative think tank Bright Blue, as well as my colleague here at PolitcsHome, Caitlin Doherty. So there's only one place to start really, although discuss maybe the Conservative Party moving on from Boris Johnson, or moving past Boris Johnson, we have to touch on this morning's news. As we just recorded, the Privileges Committee has just come out into his actions in Parliament around Partygate and recommended that if he hadn't already resigned from the Commons, he should be suspended for 90 days. Caitlin, can you pick out some of the key issues in the report, all 30,000 words of it?
Yep, so now I believe more than 18 months on from the first Partygate story appearing in the newspapers, very promptly at 9 o'clock this morning, we did get the Privileges Committee report in to Boris Johnson and whether he had misled Parliament. The committee found that he had misled Parliament multiple times with his statements about events in Downing Street during the COVID pandemic and the various degrees of lockdown that we had. Obviously, there were different rules at different times. Were he still an MP? He has now resigned as of last Friday. They would have recommended a 90-day ban, and they have also recommended that he not be allowed a former member's pass, which is a usual privilege extended to former MPs. 90
days is an extraordinarily long one. We saw Margaret Ferrier, the former SNP MP, be recommended for 30 days. Is part of this the strength of the sanction, partly to do with his actions after the report was compiled? We know that the Privileges Committee are very upset about his potential leaking of its findings and also the kind of responses that he and his supporters have had to the report, and has that kind of added to the sanctions?
So there was a lot of mention of the 9th of June, which was last Friday evening when Boris Johnson resigned, and we saw that fairly explosive statement. At that point he had seen, I believe, a draft, sort of the provisional findings of what was going to be published this week, and it does seem that reaction and sort of the response and what the Privileges Committee have suggested are attacks on the members of the committee has contributed towards these recommended sanctions. Boris Johnson has put out a statement this morning. He said that the committee was a kangaroo court and that the publication was a dreadful day for democracy. In order to reach this deranged conclusion, the committee is obliged to say a series of things that are patently absurd or contradicted by the facts. So safe to say he has not gone quietly.
Yeah. Siobhan, what's your reaction to it?
Well, listen, I haven't read 100 pages of report. I've been in meetings all day, but I will do so before the debate and if we're required to vote on this. It is really serious. I've never been dismissive of the seriousness, and the committee, I think, have worked really hard. I can also understand Boris's frustration. He lost his job over this as Prime Minister. We know that he wanted to be world king. I think Prime Minister was his second best job. You know, there's been some quite serious consequences for him as well, so I need to have a look through the report to really understand. But I mean, I've just had my head in my hands again. And you know, I go through phases of just being totally fed up with the politics of politics getting in the way of progress. And I look at what the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's trying to do. He is genuinely trying to make change, genuinely trying to move the country on from the post-pandemic issues, which we know has affected every government, every country in the world. And Stroud people also want me to get on with my job. I read a note that said Boris had said, you know, to Number 10, Eton always beats Winchester. It's not a game, you know. And Keir Starmer used 6 questions in PMQ, 6 questions when we're looking at the big impact of AI this week, when we're looking at financial matters and in mortgages, 6 questions on the honours list, knowing full well that every Labour Prime Minister has also provided an honours list, many of whom people didn't agree with. So come on, we've got to just focus and try and get on with our jobs and make sure that we're moving forward.
Well, on that note, I mean, as we've discussed, some of the responses from your Conservative colleagues have not been particularly edifying either. Do you have a message for them in terms of describing it as a kangaroo court? And we know that some of them may face their own sanctions from the Privileges Committee for the way they've responded to the report.
Because all I can do is be in control of my own behaviour. My constituents know that I I gave up my job because I wanted to become the MP for Stroud and serve people locally, and I put my kids in a car twice a week and ship them backwards and forwards, and I spent 7 days a week trying to fix problems or answer correspondence and things like that. So it's for my colleagues to decide how they behave. Again, Labour Party, opposition parties, we have some horrendous debates over things like this. I would prefer parliamentary time to be spent better. So I've literally head in hands and just getting on with things. So.
Ryan, I'll bring you in. And is it the end for Boris Johnson? Do you think this is the final curtain call? Do you think?
Well, I sympathise with Siobhan in the sense that I think the public, particularly as mortgage rates continue to rise now, cost of government borrowing is rising as well. People are obviously feeling the pain generally with the cost of living, and the idea that the sort of Conservative Party is squabbling over honours lists and who's in the House of Lords and whether Boris should remain, I think just shows to be completely out of touch. So I therefore sympathise with people like Siobhan who just want to get on with the job. I mean, my view on Boris is that, it obviously has profound consequences for him. At the end of the day, he's going to do all right, isn't he, in the long term, because, he can still make speeches and still write books and articles and make millions of pounds from that. Yeah. So, that's not to sort of downplay some of the consequences for him professionally, but, most people think he'll be able to survive because he has survived before, and no doubt he will come back. I mean, my view of Boris is that it seems to be either he did deliberately lie or he wasn't on top of the rules that he was setting, which were very draconian and obviously, caused a lot of hardship and pain and difficulty for people. Either of those things are very bad. My instinct is probably the latter, that, he was as Prime Minister going from event to event. It was all being planned for him, scheduled for him. A lot of the events he's going to involve social elements. Yeah. He would have assumed his staff was sorting all of that. But really, he should have known and been on top of the rules. And, I worked with Boris when I was a whippersnapper before the 2010 general election. And I just graduated and I was in the shadow education team. I was a researcher for David Willits, and Boris was shadow higher education minister. I wouldn't say at the weekly meeting that he had a real grip of the detail of what was coming out in terms of HE policy from the new Labour government at the time. So my instinct is that he probably wasn't on top of the detail. He wasn't really thinking about it, but he should have done.
Really keen to emphasise I'm not dismissing the seriousness, and COVID issues have affected many people across this country, but one of the best thing MPs do is knock on doors. Our weird hobby is go and doorstep people. I spent 2 hours on Saturday, my baby strapped to me, knocking on doors in one of our local villages, towns, and basically it wasn't mentioned once, apart from when I slightly led the witness and talked about dramas in politics, and then they said, oh yeah, we saw Boris. It wasn't mentioned. 2 hours, and then the night before I did an event with Conservative Party members So it went on till gone 10 o'clock. There was about 45 people in the room, and the news broke that he'd resigned at that point. There wasn't any big sort of dramatic debate at that point about what we should and shouldn't do, or what happened in the past. We are at risk in Westminster of getting caught up in these dramas, and I am really keen to kind of learn what matters on the ground.
So you think in that sense that the supporters of the party are moving on from the Boris period? Do you think that we're going to be in a post-Boris Johnson period for the Conservatives?
Well, let's see what happens after today. Yeah. I mean, I'm always sort of, good guide is my email inbox. I think my team told me the other day we'd had 3 or 4 emails about this issue, so nothing like what we got previously on Boris issues. So I just want to move forward, and I can see that Rishi does as well, and he's working really hard.
Yeah, we're going to move on to that in a second. But obviously for Rishi Sunak now, what does this kind of leave him? What happens next? We understand there's going to be a vote on this potential sanctions for Johnson probably on Monday now.
Yeah, well, in a practical sense, like you said, it looks likely that there is going to be a vote on this at the start of next week. There'd been some chatter throughout the week about whether the motion was going to be a vote or whether it was going to be like a taking note of the findings.
Yeah, or whether it's going to be amendable.
Whether it's going to be amendable, whether it was going to be a free vote, etc., etc. I think it's fairly clear to say now that there's not going to be any whipping on this vote, but it will be interesting. I'm sure there will be a lot of journalists such as ourselves going onto the Parliamentary Votes website afterwards to see which, if any, Conservative MPs didn't back it. I suppose that would be the most visible division in the party that there might have been for some time. I know this time last year there was lots of chat of factions and things like that, but it is notable in the last sort of 9 months how much things have calmed down, and I suppose there is a small risk of this sort of reigniting that, but it does really feel like that we are now in the closing days. This is, the reports come out today, it's Thursday, Monday there will be the vote, and then from a parliamentary sense, sort of that will be it. Of course, we can't rule out any MPs that might support, still posting messages on Twitter or anything like that.
Yeah.
We've seen a fair few this morning.
Yeah, Andrea Jenkins said she's backing Boris.
But in an official sense, it does feel like that will sort of be the end of the issue.
Ryan, then, if we're sort of moving beyond that, what are the kind of issues do you think that Rishi Sunak needs to focus on if he is to sort of chat about kind of a narrow path to victory? Of the Conservatives are quite far behind in the polls. What are the sort of things do you think that he needs to focus on if he is to try and drag the Conservatives back towards a winning position at the next election?
Well, I think, at the end of the day, both private incomes and public services have, on a range of metrics, either stagnated or worsened in recent years. And that's why people are angry and they're frustrated. The government needs to focus on that. Obviously, the prime task, quite rightly, is bringing down inflation. That's proving to be more difficult than first assumed.
And not entirely in the government's gift either.
No, of course, because the Bank of England is independent. But it seems to be the case that core inflation is more embedded than we first assumed. I think some of that is to do with wage rises, which understandably workers have been pushing for wage rises as a result of the price increases they're facing, particularly on energy, but also on food as well. So I think, the central thing is the economy. I personally think that the Prime Minister is wrong to make a distinction between tax cuts and cutting inflation. I think you can cut taxes, but in a funded way. So I think, increasingly over time, it's been the case that a disproportionate weight of taxation has been on work and working age people. And the two main taxes in terms of revenue for Treasury come from income tax and national insurance. My view is that if you increased some taxation on assets, so I'm thinking particularly, for example, dividends, rent, things that largely older people draw an income from their assets, that we might be able to shift the weight of taxation onto them slightly to free up some taxation, particularly thinking about income tax, to reduce it for people who are working age and younger. Well, not younger than working age, but younger than older people.
Yeah, they can't vote, unfortunately.
They can't pay
tax.
Yeah. Younger people, we're approaching 50% of the cohort going to university, taking on student loans.
Yeah.
That is a shadow tax as well. So their marginal tax rate can be particularly high.
People are really worried. I think that's the absolute emotion that I get when I speak to people. I completely understand why the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have made the economy, halving inflation, growing the economy, reducing the national debt, like a real focus. And they're saying, trust us to make those changes, because if we'll deliver on that and then we can move on. And I think people do trust Rishi to do that. He's the most financially literate Prime Minister I think we've ever had before. So I do think they will get to tax cuts, and I think they will get to more creative solutions, not least listening to people like Ryan, his think tank, who's absolutely brilliant. But on sort of younger people, I work quite closely with Onward, the think tank, and it was a report that we did together on childcare that ended up on quite a lot of Treasury officials' desks in the run-up to the spring budget. They've also done a report called The Missing Millennials, which got quite a lot of coverage, which was basically saying Conservative Party are in real trouble with younger people, but they do like the Prime Minister, and there is some hope in terms of younger people believing in Conservative values. So it was quite, but the main message on that was don't ignore millennials. I'm
a room full of millennials.
Exactly.
Here.
Well, I'm a geriatric millennial. I according to Seb Payne's one of his articles, I just squeak in. But
you're not a zennial.
I didn't know about that.
Well,
one.
there's
That's
Gen
a good
X
one.
millennial crossover. So
Right.
Rishi, I think, is a zennial. So
Zennial,
he's 42.
So I'm 42 this year, so I think I'm
You are a
millennial.
zennial,
I'm a
yes.
zennial. Well, there we go. It sounds quite exciting. What we know is that the physical trappings for youngsters are just not there. Owning your own home, starting families, stable employment, all of those things have kind of eluded quite a lot of youngsters because price rises and things like that. The starting the family bit, where youngsters have started families, this is up to sort of 45-year-olds, childcare is excruciatingly expensive, and so many parents were telling me, and are still telling me, it was making them not work at full tilt. They're stepping away from the workplace. The Chancellor I cannot tell you how many meetings we had. He really gets this.
Right.
And what he did in the spring budget was to say, we want to give parents choice. He's looking at the issues in front of him at the moment. There's a million people, a million vacancies, a million jobs. We've got high employment, but these million jobs to fill, and we've got parents saying they can't stay and work. And he created a huge package and made sure that the childcare subsidies started at 9 months, for example, rather than 3. So yeah, amazing backing on early years.
Yeah.
I think we can go further, though. I don't think the job is done, because I think what the gap that's missing is focusing on the childcare and early years workforce. And if we get that right, if we stimulate that, you get double bubbles. So you get the parents coming back into work, and you also get an enhanced workforce, of which is usually women who often do not think that they could work in any other sector. So that deals with the Mel Stride issues of the economically inactive and people not working. So it's quite an exciting area, but there is definitely more to do.
You started there by talking about the economy. That is clearly, it feels like there's a new different sort of horror story relating to the economy every week at this point. But do you have faith that what the Chancellor promised in March at the budget will be possible given the economic circumstances and context that we find ourselves in? Or do you have any fears that at some point between now and the next general election we're going to see these sort of promises chipped away or altered
on
slightly?
childcare specifically.
Yeah, childcare specifically.
Workforce is key, which is why, I'm having meetings. What's good about what the Treasury did, the Treasury are sitting in DFE meetings. I don't think that always happens, but they recognise that this is a really serious issue to make sure that we've got this workforce, so that when parents have the ability to get the additional subsidies, we've got to move away from calling it free, but, that actually there are nursery places, there are childminders there to provide them. One I would say about on the economy and horror story, we know, most people know that there is, around the world, there's been real difficulties, mortgage rates going up all over the world, inflation issues and all that sort of thing. Most people had something free during the pandemic. I know we've got short memories and we're always looking at what the most serious thing is of the day. But we spent 400 billion, everybody had something free, whether it was a vaccine thing. It was always going to be a really tough time. And I think of the two people that we have at the top at the moment, they are so far-sighted on this and smart that we will get to where we want to go, but we do have to have some patience. I get quite frustrated with the constant attacks on the country's position when we all know where we were not that long ago in the middle of a pandemic. You talked about being patient.
You don't think there's going to be an election this year? You're more likely to be towards the back end of next year? You give it as much time as possible for those things to come through?
I'm always ready. I just want to say I'm always ready. I'm in a marginal seat.
But
I chose a margin. I wanted to be there and I love the place. My sense is that the Prime Minister will want more time. This is all about the economy. Ryan is absolutely spot on. That's what will make a difference to households. That was what will make a difference to youngsters being able to buy a house, start families, and I think that will also determine when the election is.
Ryan, you said last year that millennials, if they do not have middle class parents to support them, have largely been failed by the past sort of decade of government policy, stagnant wages, being priced out the housing market, and childcare costs that we've talked about. Can this be undone, whether it is 6 months to an election or whether it's 18 months to an election? Can it be undone in time, or is there too much kind of blame of the current Conservative administration to kind of get across the line?
I think there are some achievements of the Conservative governments over the past 13 years. I think particularly of education policy and the progress in phonics in primaries and standards, the attainment gap, particularly before the pandemic. Environmental policy, employment policy, has been some gains. I do think, though, for my generation, and I'm kind of mid-millennial, maybe slightly older, I think largely there has been a failure of public policy. It has become much more difficult to kind of get to the next life stages, whether that's home ownership, starting a family. They're kind of bread and butter stuff for Conservatives. What Conservatives think is the route to a good life are those essential things: home ownership and being able to start a family. The birth rate's gone down, home ownership rate has gone down massively. And I think this is a real concern for the centre-right in this country. And it seems to be quite an Anglosphere phenomenon. If you look in the US as well, there's also an issue. Traditionally, people, as they get a bit older, tend to lean more towards the right. That isn't happening in the US and the UK.
We're talking about that age at which people start to tip over has been getting older and older.
When they start to have families. And that isn't happening. And I think part of it is material circumstances. people are just not able to go to that next life stage and feeling frustrated about that. And, Siobhan quite rightly points out the Onward report. It's not as if people are a load of socialists, they just, want lower taxes, believe in an enterprise economy, believe in building assets, but are frustrated that they can't do that even with good earnings. And I must stress this, people who believe in social mobility talking about the route to do that is through earning. But people who are earning a lot of money now are struggling to find those assets unless they inherit them. And a lot of people in my generation are starting to think, gosh, if you really want to do well and acquire those assets, is it through earnings or is it actually through investing and building companies, acquiring assets and inheriting? Now that's a difficult position, I think, for the centre-right to be in. But I don't think it's just material circumstances. I also think there's cultural reasons for why millennials are turning from the centre-right. Nearly half of the cohort went to university now, particularly women. And there is, for some reason, a strong correlation between going to university and holding more socially liberal attitudes. And I think there is a perception on certain things like cultural debate, immigration, human rights, that maybe the centre-right is not aligned with some of the kind of socially liberal views of that generation. And when I say socially liberal, I don't mean kind of far left, intersectional, communalist politics where everyone's divided into groups. I mean respecting people as individuals and the choices that they make and the freedoms that they have. For me, where does Rishi go? Rishi's like peak millennial. Like, he's sort of very fashionable. He's very tech savvy.
Tech bros. Sure.
He's done very well in his career.
Yeah.
He's sort of peak at the apex of what millennials aspire to. So you can see why he's popular. But I think the centre-right needs to do a lot more, particularly on housing. It needs to be much more radical on the supply side, also on the demand side, because the affordability of mortgages has become a lot more tight since the 2008 global financial crisis, much more difficult. So we need to think about products and services that enable people who have got stable but modest incomes and no parental support to help with the deposit to get mortgages. Decades ago, you could get 100% mortgages. You can't do that now. You need a deposit, which is pretty sizable considering house prices. And then the other thing is the birth rate and the number of people just feeling like it's too expensive to have children.
Yeah.
I know because I've got 2 children under the age of 3 and childcare is eye-wateringly expensive. The government has, considering everyone was thinking, gosh, Rishi's playing it safe, Jeremy's playing it safe, they were very bold actually on childcare policy, and Siobhan's done some excellent campaigning on that, which has really helped. I think we're uniquely high, the prices in the UK, the childcare costs.
Yeah, my sister-in-law is in Germany and the prices they pay for their stuff is ridiculous. It's a fraction of the cost that it is in the UK.
And I think some of that is to do with the ratios, which I think are unnecessarily strict in the UK. The government has said that they'll change that, relax them,
as well,
rather than abolish them, which Liz Truss, I think, was going too far with that. And also there's a kind of slowness to some of the childcare subsidies that are coming in, but some of that is to do with workforce issues.
Well, that was what I was going to bring back into the question of like whether it's happening quick enough. Do you think that's part of it?
I would love to see it move quicker, but we're not there yet. And what I was quite relieved of, so my central arguments was stimulate the workforce, get everything underpinned, and then we can move to some of the proposals that we were arguing for in the Onward report, real parental choice, childcare credits, shifting child benefits, front-loading it, and sort of making some quite radical changes. The Chancellor, working with the OBR, they scored childcare policy changes to really help the workforce. So that's why he brought it all forward, but respected the need for the kind of stages to get the workforce in place. So that's why, I mean, the media, interestingly, seem to have moved on. They feel like the childcare issue is settled, but the workforce element of it is really, really, really urgent. So I'd like to see things moving quicker, but it can't at the moment.
Yeah, sure.
I think they could be quicker if they were more creative. Bright Blue have been advocating for a long time, just as students get income contingent loans to go to HE, maybe parents should be able to access income contingent loans and that would be, if designed in a certain way, would be pretty costless to government. And I'm not saying that should replace existing childcare support. It should be voluntary and supplementary to that support. And that, by the way, would make childcare affordable overnight for everybody. There wouldn't then be a credit constraint barrier. But I think the other thing, which we sometimes forget in this debate, it goes back to this point about people finding raising children very expensive, and that's why there's a fall in the birth rate. I think the other side is that there are some families who actually want to spend time out of the labour market looking after the children. I think the government could do more on that. It doesn't have to be, because we're giving childcare support, we're against stay-at-home parents.
Yeah.
But I think more could be given to stay-at-home parents. Siobhan quite rightly talks about front-loading child benefit. I personally think that the statutory maternity pay and paternity pay is very, very low. It's like 150 quid a week.
Yeah.
It could be
As
much
someone who
more
was on
generous.
paternity leave last year, it's
not, and some people say, well, you don't want to kind of damage work incentives. I mean, the child is like 4 months old. Are we really bothered about work incentives? And transferable tax allowance as well. I think that could be more generous and not just be for married couples. It supports one-earner couples.
Yeah.
So there's things that the government can do on top of doing the childcare support.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'd love to see a really kind of wide-reaching, interesting look at how we make sure there is true parental choice, and if you want to or able or need to stay at home with your child, then let's try and see if we can make it easier. However, the issue before the Chancellor for the spring budget stage was about these vacancies. It was about getting the economy motivated. So I can completely understand why he did that, and I didn't like some of the criticism. I mean, and also some of the kind of narrative while criticising the policy was about trying to pay people to stay at home. The country is just not in that place, and also ended up in an attack on working parents. I mean, even I've got no choice unless I create a by-election. Even I started to feel a little bit like, God, I'm harming my kids, from this, which is a load. It's got to be about personal choice, and it's got to be about what's best for children. But I think what's really interesting on workforce and sort of what you were saying about university and sort of the education levels and how people are kind of voting through their lives is one of the things the Conservatives have done really well is focus on skills and apprenticeships. And I am like a massive advocate for further education. I didn't go to uni myself, couldn't stand the way Tony Blair was saying 50% of people into university, regardless of the degree, basically forgot about the rest of us, and we were left to rot. Colleges didn't get funding. So the Conservatives have started to change that tanker. It's still not in the best place. So I think the kind of tertiary education budget is about 23 billion, for example. Adult learning 5 billion quid. That needs to change. But the narrative of lifelong learning, the narrative of getting into jobs earlier with an apprenticeship, for example. And I went and sat down with
Gillian Keegan's quite keen on that. The education secretary,
she was an apprentice. But I took the apprenticeship minister to my local college, and they met two Sparky lads, electrician students, and we were saying to them, so did you see any of the government advertising about apprenticeships? They're like, no. Were you like really encouraged by sort of government encouraging? No. And they would say, well, why do you do this? And we said, well, we get paid to learn. It's so simple. But if you're getting paid to learn, you're getting closer to that, buying a house, getting closer to the ability, subject to the cost of housing and the building that we know we need to do. But actually getting people into those meaningful jobs earlier is a good thing, and the government is making that. Is a Conservative government making strides on that Labour lot didn't do.
Caitlin, just on some of that stuff we talked about workforce, and Mel Stride's been mentioned, the Work and Pension Secretary. He said that getting people back into work could have a really important part to play in whether Rishi Sunak remains Prime Minister at the next election. He even sort of suggested that the Chancellor could take 2p off income tax if economic inactivity remains sort of really stubbornly high. It seems to confound a lot of the economists' predictions and stuff around that as well in the past few months.
Economic inactivity is a really big thing for the government at the moment. We've been hearing it as a term increasingly more and more since the pandemic, but since sort of everything got back to normal, since the economy started operating as we would expect it, etc., etc. They want to get people back into the workforce, and I think what people are finding is there are so many different reasons why people are leaving or have left the workforce. You know, you've got people leaving in middle age, taking early retirement, people who maybe stopped working during the pandemic, who haven't restarted. But, you know, you've also got people with caring responsibilities, and both upwards and downwards.
Yeah.
You know, you've got people caring for older people and then also children, people needing to provide childcare. And yeah, we have had this suggestion that, you know, maybe getting more people into work would give the Treasury more headroom, as it would, you know, alleviate some of the DWP budget that is being spent at the moment. But it does really feel like sort of one of those big bubbles that's sitting across everything at the moment. You know, it's all good talking about, you know, job vacancies in the market and, you know, wages increasing and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that there are an increasing number of people who are not in work or economically inactive, which is the phrase that the government prefers to use for the moment.
Ryan, is that something that you've looked at? Is that something that you're kind of interested in?
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because if you look at the evidence around growth in the 90s and the noughties, a lot of the evidence seems to suggest that about 2/3 of that was driven in an expansion in the labour market, largely from parental, older age and migrant employment. And then the other third was sort of productivity gains in that period. So, you know, great that the government is going forward with childcare subsidies. I think that will help, probably not as much as some people assume, but it will help a bit in terms of boosting parental employment. Migrant employment, the government is saying that they want to reduce net migration. Of course, we have record levels of migration.
Yeah.
The OBR is actually saying that the kind of very low levels, anemic levels of growth that we're getting has been slightly propped up by the very high levels of migration that we're getting. The third bit is older age employment. And I think this is really interesting because I think particularly since the pandemic, the biggest increase in economic inactivity has been around over 50s. And it's interesting, actually, because you're right, the unemployment rate is historically still quite low. But a lot of people who perhaps might be in the unemployment figures are actually in economically inactive figures, which is not seeking work. But there's actually a lot of people who are long-term sick in those figures. There's a legitimate debate about where they should actually sit and what support should be available to those people.
Yeah, and long COVID and stuff as well. Hasn't
yes.
Not really worked out how we put that in the figures, essentially.
But older age employment, you know, the baby boomer generation, who we always think of as the lucky generation, you know, a lot of those, the oldest ones are now becoming elderly.
Yeah.
The youngest ones are now at the end of their working lives, and actually there's evidence that they're retiring much earlier. Now, baby boomers...
Lucky them.
Baby boomers who are, you know, more middle class, who've got assets, are very generous to their own children. You know, there's a lot of transfer of wealth, and that's great and very understandable. The biggest gift that baby boomers can give to everybody else is to work longer and to contribute, to be net contributors. And I do feel that there are a mixture of reasons for why retirement is happening a little bit earlier, which is, by the way, the opposite of what should be happening with an ageing population.
Yeah.
Part of it is down to the housing market and the appreciation in assets. So basically, empty nesters who become mortgage free know that they'll be able to downsize at some point and cash in on that equity, and that will boost up their retirement income. And pensions have been relatively generous. Not many people retiring now will be on final salary, but they will be on defined benefit schemes, whereas the rest of us, we're unlucky millennials, will be on defined contribution schemes.
Or working forever if you're a journalist.
And then I think the second thing I would say is I do think we need to look again at pensions freedoms, which were introduced by George Osborne in the mid-2010s, which basically enables people on defined benefit schemes to draw down money without it being annuitised from the age of 55. 25% of that could be tax-free. So people at the age of 55 who've got, you know, in high-paying professional jobs and good pensions can draw down a hell of a lot of money. And I think that may also be a reason why we're seeing earlier retirement. So I think we do need to look again at the age in which people can draw down both state pension but also private pension, because I feel that that may be a disincentive to working a little bit longer.
I think the Conservatives should be just really bold about work being good for you and being good for the country.
Yeah.
And I think we shouldn't be shy about that. We know all the evidence shows it's the fastest way. Work is the fastest way out of poverty. It's a good thing if you've got mental health conditions, having a purpose. We also know that young people want a purpose. They want a purposeful job. They want to know that they're contributing to society, particularly in environmental things. I mean, in local schools, I always say to people, and we're the home of Extinction Rebellion in Stroud, but I always say to kids, if you really care about the environment, please do not lie down on the floor or get stuck to anything. Go do maths, do science, go and learn and become the brilliant innovators that will solve the problems of the future. So I think we can be really bold, and I think Rishi making that case, as we've seen him do with the AI and the tech, and bring, convening countries together, I think we could be quite an exciting country on that. But you need the population to believe in it. Now, second thing on the over 50s, what the message is getting through about early retirement. I knock on doors now and people will come and we'll have a chat and they'll say, I've retired, but I worked a really long time, and I just want to explain why I've retired. And I'm like, whoa, it's completely up to you. But, actually, I am a conservative. I believe in personal choice. It's totally up to you. But that message of this is the way the country works. We put in, we take out, and actually, and having everything. But the bank of mum and dad is fascinating. I mean, it's an underlying welfare state now, isn't it? And if you're lucky enough to have that, most of us don't, but if you are lucky enough, so how can you stimulate that? Whether it's pensions, whether it's having stamp duty breaks if you're downsizing, how can you make sure that money's moving around and assisting youngsters to go forward? So I think some quite smart, creative thinking, but Labour are quite slow. They're quite clay-footed on some of this stuff. They get in a muddle. They got in a right muddle over the childcare policy. We properly pulled their pants down on this, and which was really gratifying politically. But if they'd have worked harder and been a bit more thoughtful, they would have helped me, because we could have come up with new ideas together. But similarly on work and the power of work, they are in hock to the unions. The unions don't want to see change. We've got to be bold about the need for lifelong learning. We're all going to have 2 or 3 jobs in our lifetimes. I think the Conservatives can create that narrative and offer much better than the Labour Party, and hopefully that will be appealing to many more generations.
We've touched on a lot of things here, pensions, childcare, housing, student loans. Ultimately, we're 18 months or less out from a general election, and there are some really big ideas that you've sort of suggested could be part of the solution. Is there time for this to be turned around in time for the next general election? Or are we looking at a much longer term project here for the Conservative Party?
I'm going to get the big brains on this first.
No, I think you can be, and the government should be bold. I mean, look at the poll ratings. People, when they're judging the Tories now, I think a lot of people are now looking backwards and saying, what have they delivered, rather than what are they promising and what's the vision. I think there is an opportunity being done creatively and responsibly for boldness. I think, we talked about employment. I think one thing we need to think about as well is not just increasing the number of people in work and them being longer, but also I think what's really interesting is people being able to do multiple jobs and have secondary supplementary income, side hustles, which a lot of younger people are doing. A lot of people do that out of necessity because they're struggling with the cost of living. If you think about the bottom 10% of earners, for example, they might be gig economy workers doing lots of different things. The top 10% of people in this country, probably a bit lower, often have portfolio careers, right? They may be CEOs, but they're non-exec directors on other boards, or they do a bit of consultancy. Why don't we think about how we normalise and democratise that portfolio work for people in mid-career and mid-life? Think about some of the barriers that might exist, cultural barriers, contractual barriers, administrative barriers, to enable people to do more work. And that might sound like, gosh, everyone should be in the kind of work factory all the time. But actually, because people are working from home more, there's more flexibility in work, generative AI is going to be very good at improving productivity. A lot of tasks, writing tasks, for example, research tasks, which a lot of white-collar professionals did, going to be done a lot more quickly. So I just think there's a emancipatory effect from generative AI, which may give us more time to be able to do side hustles and secondary work, which good for the individual, because it means that instead of being kind of stuck in a career where they feel that they can't change, retraining would be too expensive, particularly if you've got high expenses like children and mortgages, but also the kind of psychological impact of being stuck as well. But actually, if you're allowed to do different things, you build new skills and new network. I think that's very good private benefits, but the public benefits are just, more people doing work increases revenue for the Treasury.
Siobhan, you talked about AI then. Rishi Sunak was in America last week talking about AI. He had a lovely few days, landed on Friday morning, and then suddenly the chaos exploded again with Boris Johnson and all this kind of amazing stuff that the Conservatives want to do. Will he be able to get past the kind of internal strife? Is that, or do you think you'll still, you'll get dragged down by that?
It's why I get so grumpy personally, but I also get grumpy for him because he is a doer. I think the country can... I can't get round Tesco's now very quickly because people want to come and talk to me and tell me things, but people, that when they do talk to me, they can see that he's trying and he's trying to move things. So only he's delivered on things like the Windsor framework that nobody thought could be done. I feel in a rush. Like, I feel like, what did I want this job for? How can I best help Stroud? How can I get people there seeing that politics can be used as a force of good? And I know that there are lots and lots of people in Parliament doing that, even though the noise is not always showing that in the media. But I think, I've started, for example, an APPG on employability to look at this question of work as a power of good and how to get people work ready and into jobs and change jobs in different stages. There's a lot of things. We've got brilliant think tanks like Bright Blue, Onward, constantly churning out ideas and reports. They did a report on the hydrogen levy that's been picked up by MPs and run with. All of that activity in Parliament isn't going to make the news, but those ideas and the big changes are happening. And I genuinely believe if anybody can do it and be agile about it, it is Rishi Sunak's team, which is why it's like a different job for me now. I have to say that. It is a different job in the last 6 months or so than it was before. And I had no comparison before. I was a new intake in 2019, got smashed with the pandemic straight away. We've had a war in Ukraine. There's been issue after issue politically. The Labour Party they just eat political hate for breakfast. They're very difficult to deal with, but ultimately we are trying to problem solve at all stages. So the five commitments that the Prime Minister's made, he wants to deliver those to earn the right to do other things, but in the meantime the other things are still happening.
That's all we've got time for this week, but you can read all the latest on the big stories from Westminster at PoliticsHome.com and keep right up to date by subscribing to our 7-day-a-week newsletters by clicking on the link in the top right-hand corner of the website. Thanks to my guests, Siobhan Bailey and Ryan Shorthouse, my colleague Caitlin Doherty, and thanks to you all again for listening. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and leave us a review. If you want to get in touch, then reach out to us on Twitter at PoliticsHome or email us via news@PoliticsHome.com. But for now, I've been Alan Tolhurst, and this has been The Rundown.